Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your weekly deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Rick Spair, and joining me as always is Laura.
Rick, it is wonderful to be back with you on this Sunday edition, and I have to say, the story we are unpacking today feels like a genuine turning point for the entire artificial intelligence industry.
I completely agree because this past Friday, July 10th of 2026, Apple walked into federal court in Northern California and sued OpenAI, its own former partner, alleging a sweeping campaign of trade secret theft.
And this is not some narrow technical complaint about a single patent or one disgruntled engineer, Rick. Apple alleges a coordinated scheme to extract its confidential hardware secrets at, quote, every level of the company.
Walk us through exactly what Apple is claiming here, Laura, because the language in this complaint is some of the most aggressive I have ever seen from Cupertino's famously tight-lipped legal department.
So the complaint says, and I am quoting directly, that at every level, from members of its technical staff to its chief hardware officer, and in coordination with business partners, OpenAI has been stealing Apple's trade secrets and confidential information. That is remarkably blunt language for a court filing.
And the scale of the talent migration behind this fight is stunning because Apple points to more than 400 of its former employees who now work at OpenAI, which is an extraordinary number even by Silicon Valley standards.
Right, and to be clear for everyone listening, hiring your competitors' people is completely legal in California, where non-compete agreements are essentially unenforceable. What Apple alleges is different. They claim the hiring process itself was engineered to extract secrets.
That brings us to the most explosive individual allegation in the whole filing, which involves Tang Tan, the man who now serves as OpenAI's chief hardware officer and who previously spent years as a vice president at Apple.
Apple alleges that Tang Tan directed Apple employees who were interviewing at OpenAI to share Apple secrets as part of the interview process itself. In other words, the job interview allegedly doubled as an intelligence gathering exercise.
If that allegation holds up in court, it is a very serious problem because it transforms ordinary recruiting into what lawyers call misappropriation by improper means, which sits at the very heart of trade secret law.
Exactly, and there is more. Apple also claims OpenAI coached departing employees on how to evade Apple's internal security processes on their way out the door. And it names one former employee, Chang Liu, who allegedly stole an Apple laptop before joining OpenAI.
A physical laptop is such a striking detail in a case like this because modern trade secret disputes usually revolve around cloud downloads and personal email forwards rather than someone allegedly walking out with actual company hardware.
It echoes the most famous trade secret case in tech history, Rick. Back in 2017, Waymo sued Uber after engineer Anthony Lewandowski downloaded thousands of confidential files about self-driving technology before departing. That case ultimately settled for roughly $245 million in Uber equity.
And Apple itself has been down this road before because in 2022, the company sued a chip startup called Revos, alleging that departing engineers took confidential system on chip designs with them, and that dispute eventually settled as well.
So Apple has a playbook here, and they know exactly how these cases unfold. But let us give listeners the backstory because what makes this lawsuit so dramatic is that these two companies were celebrated partners barely 2 years ago.
That is the part that fascinates me. Back in 2024, Apple and OpenAI announced a landmark deal that put ChatGPT directly into the iPhone's operating system. And at the time, it was hailed as the alliance that would define consumer artificial intelligence.
It was always a marriage of convenience, though. Apple needed cutting-edge AI capability it had not built internally, and OpenAI desperately needed distribution to billions of devices. Each side got exactly what it lacked, and it worked beautifully until their interests collided.
And the collision came when OpenAI decided it wanted to build hardware of its own, which meant marching directly onto Apple's home turf, the one territory Apple defends more fiercely than anything else in its entire empire.
The pivotal moment was OpenAI's acquisition of I/O Products, the device startup founded by Jony Ive, Apple's legendary former design chief. for $6.4 billion. The moment that deal closed, today's collision became almost inevitable.
For anyone who does not know the history, Jony Ive is the designer behind the iMac, the iPod, and the iPhone itself. So watching him team up with Sam Altman to build a rival device must have felt like a betrayal inside Apple Park.
What makes this even spicier is that we still do not know exactly what OpenAI's device actually is. Reporting has described a screen-free, pocketable companion gadget built around voice and ambient computing, which sounds exactly like the kind of product Apple's own secret labs have explored for years.
Which is precisely why the overlap matters legally, because if both companies were exploring similar form factors, Apple will argue the resemblance comes from stolen knowledge, while OpenAI will argue it comes from convergent design instincts, especially with Jony Ive himself holding the pen.
And notice how the lawsuit frames the timeline, Rick. Apple alleges the I/O acquisition encroached on hardware technology developed during the very period when the two companies were working together on the Siri and ChatGPT integration. That partnership is the connective tissue of the entire complaint.
So Apple is essentially arguing that while OpenAI was sitting inside the tent as a trusted partner, it was simultaneously studying the tent poles, measuring the canvas, and recruiting away the people who knew how to build the tent.
That is a perfect way to put it, and it explains the second bombshell that landed alongside this lawsuit. Apple has confirmed that the new version of Siri, arriving this autumn of 2026, will abandon ChatGPT entirely and run on Google's Gemini model instead.
Let us sit with that for a moment, because Apple choosing Google as its artificial intelligence partner after decades of rivalry between these two companies is one of the great plot twists in modern technology history.
It really is, and the strategic logic is fascinating. Google already pays Apple tens of billions of dollars every year to remain the default search engine on iPhones, so extending that relationship into AI deepens a partnership both sides already understand and trust.
And for everyday iPhone users, the practical question is what actually changes this autumn, because most people never stop to think about which underlying model answers when they talk to the assistant on their phone.
Honestly, most users will simply notice better answers and never know why, which is exactly how Apple likes it. The company sells the experience rather than the engine underneath, and it will happily swap engines whenever a better one comes along at acceptable terms.
Meanwhile, for OpenAI, losing the Siri integration means losing a direct pipeline to well over 1 billion active devices, which is arguably the most valuable consumer distribution channel that exists anywhere on the planet right now.
And the timing could not be more brutal, because OpenAI is widely reported to be preparing for a public offering, with valuation targets floating somewhere between $830 billion and a full $1 trillion. This lawsuit lands squarely in the middle of that window.
Explain why that matters so much for the public offering process, Laura, because I think many listeners may not appreciate just how much damage active litigation can do to a company trying to sell itself to public market investors.
When a company files to go public, it must disclose material risks in its registration documents. An active litigation from a roughly $3 trillion adversary with effectively unlimited legal resources is about as material as risk gets. Every institutional investor will now price that uncertainty into the offering.
So even if Apple never wins a single motion in court, the lawsuit is already imposing a real cost on OpenAI, which raises the uncomfortable question of whether that was part of the strategic calculation all along.
Let me play devil's advocate for a moment then, because OpenAI's defenders will argue this is exactly what it looks like when an incumbent uses the courthouse to slow down a competitor it could not stop in the marketplace.
And there is genuine precedent for that skepticism, because large companies do sometimes weaponize trade secret claims against emerging rivals, knowing that the discovery process alone can freeze a young company's product roadmap for years while the legal bills pile up.
OpenAI's official response leans into exactly that framing. The company said, quote, "We have no interest in other companies' trade secrets. We remain focused on building innovative technology that empowers people everywhere." Translation, this is a distraction, not a reckoning.
But to be fair to Apple's side of the argument, The specificity of these allegations matters because courts treat named individuals, described documents, and concrete acts very differently from vague claims that former employees simply carried knowledge in their heads.
That is the key legal distinction, Rick. California fiercely protects employee mobility, and workers absolutely own the general skills and experience they accumulate over a career. What nobody owns is the right to take documents, prototypes, specifications, or supplier terms. And this complaint alleges exactly those kinds of takings.
So walk us through what Apple actually has to prove under trade secret law, because I suspect the legal standard is more demanding than most people outside the profession would assume it to be.
Under the Federal Defend Trade Secrets Act, which Congress passed back in 2016, Apple must show three things. The information derives real economic value from being secret, Apple took reasonable measures to protect it, and OpenAI acquired or used it through improper means. All three elements must hold together.
And that second element becomes fascinating in this particular case because if Apple can show OpenAI specifically coached people to circumvent its security protocols, that simultaneously proves the protocols existed and that someone deliberately worked around them.
Which is why the coaching allegation might be the most legally consequential claim in the entire filing, even though the stolen laptop makes for the better headline. Deliberate circumvention of security measures is precisely the kind of fact pattern that wins these cases.
Now let us talk about remedies, because Apple is not just asking for money here, and the range of possible outcomes stretches from a quiet settlement all the way to something that could genuinely reshape OpenAI's hardware ambitions.
The nightmare scenario for OpenAI is an injunction, meaning a court order blocking development or shipment of any device a judge believes was built using misappropriated Apple technology. For a company racing to launch its first hardware product, even a temporary injunction could be devastating.
There is also the discovery process itself, which cuts both ways because Apple will get to depose OpenAI executives under oath about exactly how the I/O device was designed, and OpenAI will get to probe how much of this Apple actually knew and when.
And do not forget the human dimension, because more than 400 former Apple employees at OpenAI are now potential witnesses in a bitter fight between their old employer and their new one. That is an enormously uncomfortable position for working engineers who simply changed jobs.
It also sends a chilling message across the whole industry because every artificial intelligence lab recruiting from big technology companies will now have its lawyers reviewing interview scripts and onboarding checklists to avoid becoming the next defendant.
Recruiters are probably rewriting their playbooks this very weekend, Rick. Expect explicit instructions telling candidates to bring absolutely nothing and share absolutely nothing, and expect new hires from rivals to be walled off from sensitive projects during their first several months. Compliance just became a competitive necessity.
Zoom out with me for the bigger picture because the commentary around this case keeps repeating one striking phrase that the cooperation era of big tech artificial intelligence is formally over. Do you buy that framing, Laura?
I largely do. The early phase of the AI boom forced strange alliances because nobody could do everything alone. Microsoft funded OpenAI, Apple embraced ChatGPT, Amazon backed Anthropic. But as each player builds out its own full stack, former partners are converting into rivals almost everywhere you look.
In this case is the sharpest example yet because the very same company that Apple once put on stage as its flagship artificial intelligence partner now stands accused in a federal complaint of systematically looting the crown jewels.
The Google angle completes that picture because Apple did not respond to the breakdown by retreating from AI. It simply swapped partners, which tells you these alliances are now purely transactional arrangements, held together by interest rather than trust, and renegotiated the moment those interests shift.
So give me your honest prediction before we wrap up, Laura. When we look back on this lawsuit in 3 years, will we see a landmark trial verdict, a quiet settlement, or something else entirely?
History says settlement because Waymo against Uber settled, Apple against Revo settled, and trade secret trials are genuinely rare beasts. But the I/O device timeline changes the calculus because if Apple can credibly threaten an injunction before launch, it holds leverage that money alone cannot match. So I expect a settlement, but an expensive and possibly humbling one.
My instinct agrees with yours, though I would add that the Siri switch to Gemini may prove more consequential than the lawsuit itself, because litigation ends with lawyers shaking hands, while distribution decisions quietly compound for a decade.
Beautifully said, Rick. Listeners should watch 3 things in the coming months: the autumn Siri launch running on Gemini, any motion for a preliminary injunction against OpenAI's device, and how OpenAI's public offering paperwork describes this case. Those 3 signals will tell us who is really winning this war.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.